Welcome to episode 9 of the pseudo-legendary Hilo Pro Show. I'm Richard Ryan.
And I'm Garrett Chaffin-Quiray.
And we are going to be reviewing Re-Animator and A Dangerous Method.
I'd like to take you back a few years to when I was beginning to try to be a film scholar. The cover of this first publication that I was involved with, it featured an image of Herbert West. Not quite the protagonist of the story of Re-Animator, but basically who the whole movie hovers around. He is the Re-Animator of all of these people that he kills. So
he is the anti-hero, and he is the eponymous anti-hero of the H.P. Lovecraft story upon which the movie is very loosely based.
The next take, you remember Joe Bob Briggs. I presume you've read him.
Oh, my fellow Texan, Joe Bob Briggs, the hero of ultimate trash cinema, yes.
He's got to be my on-ramp to thinking about how movie writing can appeal to an everyday person.
But he was a very educated intellectual man who presented himself
as a dummy, redneck guy.
As a redneck just counting up the number of breasts that you saw in the movie.
Now, all of that's true. He definitely was presenting that persona, but as you say, he's a university-educated journalism major who became a real reporter, but he found a side gig doing movie reviews, I think, somewhere along the lines of his life in his 20s, and parlayed that into a persona that he's been wearing as Joe Bob Briggs for the last 40 years or so. I began reading his column when it was syndicated in my local San Diego newspaper when I was probably 11 or so. I remember it being around the end of 5th grade into 6th grade. And they were easy to read. The vocabulary he would choose was very conducive to a young reader as I was then. But also, as I've grown older, I've realized that communicates with a lot of people who don't want to go about highfalutin European art cinema or what's happening in Far East Asian cinema. They instead want to talk about the banalities of very low material.
It's kind of like the audience for our podcast.
It's a little bit what we're involved with. So when we were spitballing what episode 9 should concern, and we settled on this pairing of Re-Animator and A Dangerous Method, these files came into my memory of Joe Bob Briggs, who you're whispering this and that. The fact that when Re-Animator was released, older kids who were in my circle were talking about the nudity and the violence, and these are definitely things I understood I was never going to be allowed to see. But then we advanced a few years into the home video revolution when various friends of mine had more permissive parents than I did, and we went through a whole bunch of very terrible movies to see the born naked bodies and the terrible violence that we never got to Re-Animate.
I doubt anybody who in the last 10 or 15 years watched Re-Animator has not seen the unedited version of it. I saw Re-Animator in the theater when it first came out and thought that it was of its type a masterpiece.
One feature I want to just point out, I happen to know that what was in simultaneous release when this was in theaters was a movie I did go see, and that's Back to the Future. But I was about to be terribly concerned with the nudity and violence of something like Re-Animator.
Like Joe Bob Briggs, you wanted to know what the boob count was.
I did, and there's a relatively low but solid count in this movie. Let me just foreground that. So to circle back to this weird, forbidden object that my parents definitely poo-pooed that I wasn't allowed to go see. We never quite made the rounds with this video thing with my kid friends growing up. And I didn't pull it off the shelf when I was a young adult trying to treat movies seriously while I was in university. To now circle back in my middle years, it's this interesting view of what was happening in the 1980s because Re-Animator remains, even today, kind of gnarly. There's a lot of really impressively dark, mysterious, and violent things that happen.
And I think one of the things that you're pointing to is that there was, in the 80s, that transition. First of all, there were things like Showtime Midnight, and
that's right.
You could start to see what we would politely call softcore porn on your television,
right?
Which
it took away the shame and embarrassment of having to go to a shopkeeper and buy or rent it at heavy cost, which was shameful and embarrassing,
right? And we're talking about 10 years before the internet, sort of widely what we call the web now, widely becomes available in the mid 90s, in which you can see the most explicit and shocking porn you possibly can imagine, and now it's it's the sea of libidinal imagery that we all float in.
Re-Animator centers on a character called Herbert West, played by Jeffrey Combs. He is a journeyman graduate student in Europe who, with his professor named Hans Gruber, by the way, that will become, of course, Alan Rickman's breakthrough role by name in Die Hard a few years on, they together create a serum that allows them to reanimate the dead, but it does not go well because the reanimated dead don't behave like their former lived selves. They're zombie monsters that harm people. West is kicked out of his university and washes ashore in the United States, where he meets a young medical school student named Daniel Kane, played by Bruce Abbott, who has a girlfriend named Megan Halsey, played by Barbara Crampton.
Can I just say, girl?
So we have Daniel dating Megan. Herbert becomes his roommate, who does experiments to redo this reanimation project in the basement of the apartment building. And all of them are sort of sucking up to Dr. Carl Hill, played by the British actor David Gale. This guy, Dr. Hill, has eyes on Megan. Megan's father is the dean of the medical school, and that's kind of the essential cast. In the end of the story, Megan has to come to the defense of Daniel and save him, but is killed in the process, and Herbert's reanimation serum is used on her, and she is revivified as the movie stops. Hint, there are sequels to this movie. To backpedal to some of the elements that make this movie so extraordinary, to the video nasty people who enjoyed it back in the late 80s, and who have made a cult experience of it ever since, we need to remark on the fact that the people who are reanimated are like the conventional zombies of now. They don't have speech, they don't have very fine motor skills, they just swamp people and then bleed them and cause them to become these zombie characters as well. They are a virus. We also must know, and this is definitely important, that Dr. Hill, this guy in charge of the medical school experiences of Daniel, Herbert, and to a lesser degree Megan, wants Megan for himself. He is killed partway through the movie. His head is severed from his body. The head and the torso are separately reanimated, and they work together to sexually assault Megan. This is one of the main things that people who saw it then found so titillating and exciting.
I'm very disappointed, Garrett, that you are laughing about the sexual assault of a beautiful young woman tied to a morgue table, a metal morgue table, right, by a decapitated college professor. It was so unbelievably extreme, and you couldn't believe that you were watching it, that not only Joe Bob Briggs, but someone like Pauline Kael could praise, as she did, Re-Animator as an extraordinary movie that pressed all kinds of boundaries, and within the very particular terms that it set for itself, succeeded wildly. And
I'm glad that you brought Kael into this, because that's a high-end kind of a critic, and we've already mentioned Joe Bob, who's a low-end kind of a critic, but they're both competing for a way to explain a basic fact. A head attempts to give head. and that thing has just moved through popular culture ever since.
High five!
Right.
Across the podcast.
And this has been in my memory since the late 80s when I knew about this movie. The thing is, it's interrupted.
You can't unsee that scene. Once you've seen David Gale's head moving down between Barbara Crampton's spread open legs, Stuart Gordon, he got his start in Chicago theater, and he was famous for doing avant-garde plays. He was a close friend of David Mamet's. He did Brecht plays, and so he clearly saw this, I think, as a kind of avant-garde experiment, the movie as a whole, but this now notorious and legendary scene in particular as a way of seeing how far he could push the American cinematic pop cultural envelope. And indeed, he pushed it to an extreme that it had never been before and was widely celebrated. by critics of all sorts.
It was never a terribly popular movie. It didn't earn a lot of money. Not a lot of people have seen it, but it earned plenty to be profitable on its scale.
It's a cult film, meaning that you have to
have an appetite and a tolerance for what it's trying to do.
Exactly.
But there's something giddy about the whole movie. Now, just yesterday I was talking with someone about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a point of reference, which to me is one of the most unpleasant movies that I've ever seen, and it remains so 50 years later.
I think that Re-Animator holds together and is a much more cohesive and elegantly told story than Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Well, that would be my call.
It's also simply a more entertaining movie because it's not trying to punish. It is in its way pretty funny. The idea that this libidinous professor at a medical school is so taken with the dean's daughter that he just can't help himself, even after the death divide from which he has been reanimated, to want to taste her through oral sex, is a huge gag.
Let me go!
That's it, my dearest Meg. More passion.
Oh my God!
Yes, my love.
I must say, Dr. Hill, I'm very disappointed in you. You steal the secret of life and death, and here you are, trysting with the bubble-headed co-ed. You're not even a second-rate scientist.
Ah, Mr. West.
People expect a certain amount of comedy in a certain kind of horror film. And Jordan Peele's Get Out would be a good example of a very celebrated film that's often described as horror comedy. Or anybody who's sat in a big movie audience and watched a scary over the top horror film has heard people around him or herself laughing.
Ha 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 ah ah ah. It's just where you emphasize the syllable. And it's so close, it's a knife's edge. And it can instantly switch from one to the other depending on what you're experiencing.
And if you think about the core characters in Re-Animator, so you think about Megan and Herbert and Bruce and Dr. Gale. Dr. Gale's kind of creepy, but certainly Megan and Bruce, and even Herbert in his own kind of nerdy, intense way, are not bad people. And yet they suffer horrible fates. And we kind of laugh at this as we watch the movie, and we're invited to laugh at it. And I think we'll get to this in A Dangerous Method about how uncomfortable we are with the dark parts of life and how we deal with that discomfort by laughing at it.
Well, there's two things that come out of what you just said. And one is, the simple kernel of this movie is that a man is driven to figure out a way to bring back the dead. Everybody has somebody they treasure who's now deceased.
I belong to a religious order, we'll call it Christianity for lack of a more specific term, that actually believes that redemption and resurrection are possible. And within the Christian context, resurrection is seen as a glorious thing, as a great blessing that God confers upon his creatures. In the Lovecraftian universe, which is kind of an anti-Christian view. In the Lovecraftian universe of Re-Animator, the idea of bringing people back from the dead is not only not a good thing, it's actually a really, really terrible thing.
Well, and that's the second core value that this movie simply spins around. The one is how to bridge death and bring somebody back, but the other is how to accept death. And the fact of what Herbert manages to do with his former professor and then do with Daniel's help in the basement of their apartment building, eventually to Megan at the conclusion of the movie, is bring somebody back who should be allowed to go. On occasion, a life, well or badly lived, runs out of its essential steam, and somebody should be allowed death. We could talk about people we detest, who we want to not be on the mortal coil anymore, but the fact is we're all going to go. And this movie reflects on the fact, as you just pointed out, sometimes when that occurs and somebody is killed or dies or whatever the conditions may be, we shouldn't be able to stand in the way and reverse that. There's something that is, quote, natural, unquote, about it, and we need to accept it. And the fact of what horror and genre, movies and literature work through is the degree to which we can fantastically change that calculus and then figure out what might come next. And in the case of this movie and the series that it created, the franchise, it's all bad news. Once Dr. Hill is killed, and he's severed from his head, so there's the animated body and the animated head working in tandem, he realizes that his reanimated self is sort of the alpha who can control other reanimated dead people. And in my experience, thinking back, this is the first time that I believe a zombie movie, again, in my experience, has postulated the idea that there can be a master controller for all these zombie bodies that bend to his will, and they do so telepathically, which is convenient for a low-budget movie. You don't have to have a whole bunch of sets or tech. You just say, he can control them with his mind, and then your actors do what he wants them to go do, which leads to some fun stunt work, some gross-out stuff in a hospital, and so on. But that's an interesting loop. Telepathic control across these undead, reanimated corpses by the one who realizes it can control them better than the others is kind of a way to create an army. And in fact, Dr. Hill kind of does that. He amasses all of these reanimated corpses from the morgue of a hospital, and they end up attacking all of the well people of the world, up to and including eventually Megan.
So starting with Night of the Living Dead, right? Probably
that's kind of the birth of our modern zombie.
Yeah,
right?
the uber classic of zombie movies. Zombies are portrayed as mindless entities that just want to destroy and devour and turn other people into zombies. Dr. Gale, of this higher evil intelligence who seems to exist on another dimension, that's maybe the element of Re-Animator that's most about Lovecraft, which is the idea that evil is not just random and incomprehensible, but actually has a kind of demonic and directed intelligence behind it.
Well, one of the things I am aware of is that over the last 50 plus years since Night of the Living Dead, and we could go back earlier and trace the zombie in other forms, but let's begin there. As we work forward from 68 through the present, we can create a correspondence between what a zombie represents as a metaphor for social ills, one sort or another. But this movie does take the idea that it's not a metaphor for something else. It is an evil that finds its portal into our world through the reversal of the death or the life-to-death process. It's not that they have the will to go eat and consume or turn people. It's that an evil has now propagated in their bodies. And in fact, the viral motif is important because we've just come out of the COVID times and all of the rest. But the way that a virus works, it doesn't have a will to do harm. It's an amoral thing. It's consuming. That's what it does. But this manifestation, through the character of Dr. Hill and his severed body and head combo kind of a thing, he's targeting. There's an intelligence at work that makes him want to do certain things. And that's what makes his gooey interest in Megan so weird at a deeper level of thinking than the gross outs of this.
Okay, so all right, we're getting into very interesting genre thematic critiques here. What I would say about horror and a lot of its most articulate and intelligent proponents, like Stephen King, for instance, have noted horror, both as a literary and as a cinematic genre, it has a deep fear of rationality and specifically of science. Mm-hmm. So if you think of an obvious precursor to Re-Animator, which would of course be James Whale's Frankenstein, mm-hmm. It's the villains, the people who are doing the bad things that are causing all this terror and destruction are scientists. Let's take 28 Days Later, right?
Right.
It opens in a scientific laboratory where animals are being subjected to. They're trying to weaponize monkeys with this rage virus, and so the idea is that medical science is inherently going to produce really, really horrible results. And that is such a common theme in horror. It's why horror movies are so popular with, like, the working classes, right? It's because intellectuals in general and scientists in particular are seen as people who are actually doing more harm than good.
An additional detail that crops up in my mind, because this movie is from 1985, and the idea of a nerd culture, that word becomes popular. I'd say.
And Herbert West has got nerd written all over him.
He's somewhere in the spectrum. He's so weird in his personal behaviors and the way that actor portrays the role. I mean, Jeffrey Combs sort of brings it hard as this guy you don't want to talk to at a cocktail party, but yet it's also understood that he's wicked smart. So not only is there this antipathy about technological skill or scientific capability or having a big old brain, it's coupled with behavioral disorder and atypical organization of how somebody socializes, or indeed in the case of Herbert, he cannot socialize. That all bubbles up in the middle 80s, which for me, again, that throwback to when I was a boy coming of age, hearing about this movie and others like it, it only seems natural that a socially misfit human called a nerd is both good at cutting-edge tech, whether that's a PC or creating new engineering for a car company, or indeed this weird day-glow green Re-Animator fluid is going to be coupled with a damnation, the creation of monstrosity through all of this great brain smarts and so on.
Stuart Gordon, the director of Re-Animator, his great brush with cultural success was as one of the writers of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which is a fine example of a movie that takes that dynamic that we were just discussing, which is how science gets out of control and does the wrong thing. You've got a scientist who shrinks his kids and could have easily killed all three of them in really horrible ways. And in fact, in the course of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, they're like attacked by a scorpion, and they have all sorts of horrible things almost happen to them. And then, of course, they end up having this great Hobbit-like, Lord of the Rings style adventure, and coming back to the Shire and being happy. But it's an example of Stuart Gordon's sensitivity to the idea that science and technology walk this very, very thin line between wonderment and really horrible, awful things happen to you.
This might be then a good twist to pivot towards A Dangerous Method, because what I think puts these two movies in conversation, and thus the high lowbrow show that we're involved with here, is that A Dangerous Method is concerned with the way that the mind's dark circuitry becomes an explorable space for the scientific mind at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, and is opened as a place for people to rationally discover the rules of how the subconscious work, the rules of how the unconscious, and of how sexuality works, to help organize behavior that's then transformed through a stage play adapted into a movie by David Cronenberg, who we know is one of the body horror specialists on par with no peer from the 1970s onward, and yet A Dangerous Method is a pretty clean movie with respect to violence. It's sexed up, and that's exciting, but it is about Freud and Jung and a couple of their key collaborators coming of age in the teens and 20s of the last century, figuring out how to control the libido and making kind of a hash of it all. The thing to emphasize about A Dangerous Method when it becomes a movie of its moment, it's defined by being first a festival movie. It's released at the Venice Film Festival, where it develops some attention in the fall of 2011, but it comes to market in the mix with The Skin I Live In by Almodovar was in theaters, Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen in theaters, J. Edgar by Eastwood in theaters, Melancholia by Von Trier in theaters, The Artist by Michael Hazanavicius in theaters, Shame by Steve McQueen in theaters. We need to talk about Kevin.
I have to tell you that Shame is like one of my favorite films.
It's also Michael Fassbender.
Shame and Dangerous Method are
simultaneous release.
Yeah.
What a weekend that would have been.
He was just
on fire at that early point in his career.
Well, and remains so. I mean, he like one of his co-stars in Dangerous Method, Viggo Mortensen, can seem to do nothing wrong.
That's right.
They're both like, they do genre films. They do this is the line that, again, to go back to what we were saying about Barbara Crampton, she never seemed to be able to cross. I think it's easier for men
I think you're
to cross this, right? George Clooney can start out as
Facts of Life and become From Dusk Till Dawn, and then become like America's favorite genius actor, investor in liquors.
The last movie star, as he was famously described on the cover of Time magazine. Yes, my point about Barbara Crampton is when Re-Animator became not a huge off-the-scale hit, she said to her agent, now you can get me in real films. And he said, my dear, you don't understand. You were in a horror film. You're now branded.
I do want to make a point that any career in the public arts is difficult. No matter whether somebody's meteoric and has a quick rise to wonderful success, riches, celebrity fame, and awards, or a long, slow slog through decades, it's all difficult. But there do seem to be advantages to being a male. And it is true, I think, that the objectification of a woman's body, particularly in things like comic performances, horror performances, romantic stories, is tied to being a youthful, semi-clad, if not naked body, thus the Crampton problem. But the final thing about this 2011 moment when A Dangerous Method shows up, and I think you're gonna dig this, Steven Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin was also in theaters. So in that moment, this movie, A Dangerous Method, creeps up, and I suppose the brief snapshot would be we're in the early teens of the previous century, just before World War I kicks off. We're primarily looking through the point of view of a young Carl Jung, played by Michael Fassbender, and all this Irish...
Jung,
not
young.
Jung, right.
Young.
Who is enamored of the professional accomplishment of his elder, Sigmund Freud, played by Viggo Mortensen. But the movie is organized around the fact that Jung becomes the caregiver and medical practitioner trying to help a seemingly crazed and hysterical woman, and that's played by Keira Knightley as Sabina Spielrein. These three people are all real people, and they're all dramatized through these performers who are all of them wickedly gifted and absolutely take turns stealing scenes from one another. This then defines the way that Jung becomes a Freudian and breaks from Freud across a couple of years of their association as the elder Freud, becomes disenchanted with his upstart who doesn't seem to be following the right path because of his involvement with this young woman who he can't disentangle himself from and become sexually involved with.
There's another key performance in this movie which I just want to call out because both the actor and the actual historical figure are largely forgotten now, except for people like me who find the history of psychoanalysis is utterly fascinating. And that would be Victor Cassell's amazing, relatively small but crucial performance as Otto Gross, who died of starvation in the streets of Berlin, and who was a key figure in the not only in the early era of psychoanalysis, but had an enormous influence on Carl Jung.
I also think that Vincent Cassel is a really interesting performer who's done a lot of interesting work.
He's one of those guys who again, we were talking about pigeonholing. He's a character actor, right?
In America, he's an English-speaking world. I think in France, he's quite a big deal all on his own. But his job in this movie is to say to Jung, listen, you have this rationale, this method that controls how you behave with patients because you're trying to find actionable proof that psychoanalysis is scientifically valid because that's the thing you're grinding away at. But what you're missing is that part of what attracts people to other people is a sexual urge that you are artificially chaining down. And Otto says, unchain yourself. Be sexual.
Doesn't matter what you call it as long as you don't let the experience escape. That's my prescription.
There's an argument among Jung scholars about whether or not Spielrein and Jung actually had a sexual relationship. They clearly were obsessed with each other, and she, like Otto Gross, were part of dislodging him from Freud's orbit. Freud had this attitude about psychoanalysis, is that it had to be medical, it had to be scientific, and as the movie makes very clear, it couldn't be associated explicitly with Jews.
Right. To me, that was one of the more noteworthy things about this movie. It makes a very clear division between ethnic Jewishness, therefore Freud, and non-Jewish psychological evaluation, thus Jung.
Freud was tragically very well aware of how deep anti-Semitism ran in German-speaking culture, and we're talking about in the teens and the 20s, and this is a recurring theme in the movie, that he does not want psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory to be seen as a Jewish theory.
It's not a Semitic trope about how to analyze the human condition.
Yeah.
It's a general one that he wants to be. Well, and the other interesting thing is the talking cure, that phrase, is what this dangerous method is all about.
Right.
And of course, 100 years plus on, where we are today, this is an accepted aspect of how we perform therapy. How it is that people get along with their friends, talk through things. But it was
you have to be explicit. You have to take what's silent, what's buried just beneath the surface. You have to make explicit what it is that's happening, and that's.
We don't think of that as an important breakthrough because we've lived with it now for 4 generations or so. But this movie is trying to trace the moment in time in which a group of people, these psychoanalysts working in the Freudian method, were trying to establish this pattern of analysis, behavior, and interpretation of human behavior and conduct to unlock a bunch of problems that people were having. And again, just to reemphasize, we now largely accept the talking cure as a truth. It's how we make dirty jokes, it's how we get along with our buddies, it's how we talk up to our managers and our job circumstances. But more than 100 years ago, when this movie is set, we're watching people establish that as a pattern, as a set of rules that a person can move through and govern the ungovernable by making it communicable to others.
The so-called Victorian Age, which existed just as much in the rest of Europe and America as it did in England, involved the idea that you had very specific ways of talking to each other. Now, what we're dealing with is this astonishing figure. And what's interesting about Freud, he developed this idea of the unconscious and the idea of repression and the idea that there were various channels, for instance, like dreams. And some of the most important things that happen to us, we don't articulate, we don't actively express.
This movie, when it's talked about, it usually turns on, isn't Mortensen wonderful as Freud? Oh yeah, and Fassbender is great as Jung. But I want to tell you that for me, the emotional hook that got me started in enjoying this movie is Keira Knightley's performance. She is off the hook crazed when we first meet her. A woman who is completely out of physical control. She's chomping her teeth, she's grinding her body, she's shifting all around, completely unable to sort out what troubles her. And as we move through the course of the movie, and she gains a greater appreciation for why she is upset, and doing all of this with accents, right? Because she's a Russian émigré.
She somehow gets placed in the clinic, which Jung was the director of, and she's subjected to some of the barbarous treatments that other people, with mental illness, so to like being tied up and dropped in cold water,
right?
And
forcefully bathed by really, really ornery nurses,
and then she meets Jung, who, under his tutelage by Freud, is of course now a much more sensitive and gifted psychotherapist. He also happens to be a very attractive man.
Yeah, and Fassbender's hot stuff.
And Sabina Speldrein clearly was a very attractive woman, and also an incredibly intelligent and educated woman. And she emerges very quickly from what would have been called her hysteric or her mentally ill state.
Well, so what causes me, I watched these movies in back-to-back days.
Yeah.
And what, of course, the obvious thing is that we're watching a woman's body and soul and personhood being manipulated by more powerful men around her and turned into something else. In the case of Re-Animator, we're watching this woman's body be turned into a sexual object that is desired by at least 2 of the 3 main male cast members of that movie. In this movie, we're watching a young woman being turned into a kind of a malleable plaything, but to give her therapy and self-help to organize better.
I don't think any alpha male minds watching Keira Knightley get spanked by Michael Fassbender. I'm sorry, but it's just
it certainly comes up right.
It's not an unpleasant.
And when she demands that he perform this role differently and better, to give her the kind of pain or anguish that she craves, which will remind her of her father doing that to her as a child as a way of disciplining her in her youth.
this was literally true. She went from being this woman who was locked up in Jung's clinic to first a close friend and a lover, and then a disciple of Freud's. And it was because surfacing all that stuff under, just beneath the surface of conscious mentation, became the way that she managed to use her intelligence and interact with men in a way that was, I mean, her relationship in the movie, and I think also in real life, was that she and Jung had a very passionate relationship, but she realized that he was a married man and was never going to leave his incredibly wealthy wife, who provides him with this, as you see in the movie, this incredible existence in a huge mansion with his own red sailboat,
and was permissive about him running around on her with other lovers, including this young woman, Sabina.
Yes.
And she was the first of a string. This was all understood by the missus, who didn't necessarily like it, but tolerated it in her gifted man.
What's so fascinating about this is that you had these two incredibly different men, both equally brilliant, who both saw the human mind and the problems of the unconscious in many of the same terms, and yet came to incredibly different conclusions about them. And then you have this woman and this is
she can see both points of view.
It's part of the drama. It's part of the brilliant dramatic psychological dynamic. Is that you have a woman mediating between these two equally brilliant but totally different men, and she ultimately decides for Freud.
There's a funny scene that it charmed me, where Jung is invited to Freud's household, and we see the two men in close mid-shots at the dining table, and we believe that they're alone.
If, for instance, we could come up with some milder term than libido, we might not encounter such emotional resistance. It would make the teaching side of things much easier.
Is euphemism a good idea? Once they work out what we actually mean, they'll be just as appalled as ever.
I take your point, but I still think it's worth trying to sweeten the pill when it comes to questions of sexuality.
And by the way, please don't feel you have to restrain yourself here. My family are all veterans of the most unsuitable topics of mealtime conversation.
And we get a long shot then of the table, and it's Mrs. Freud and the 4 or 5 children all waiting for Jung to engage in the conversation that the old man is saying, it's all right, talk about whatever you wish, they've all heard it.
I have a number of clinical examples which I believe support my position with regard to sexuality.
Freud insisted that psychoanalysis be entirely scientific and specifically not associated with any kind of what he regarded as weird, silly mysticism. And Jung, in fact, famously becomes obsessed with various kinds of metaphysics and paranormalism. Jung is on record as saying that at the root of all mental illness and neurosis is some kind of spiritual element. Jung becomes the leader and the founder of the New Age movement. I mean, the entire idea that there are these paranormal or metaphysical states that actually make us, give us a certain kind of transcendence is really something that starts with Jung, and that we identify to this day with Jung. And this is why in the 60s, for instance, people like, Ram Dass and Timothy Leary and so forth identified so much with Jung. I mean, you can imagine that Herbert West, our hero, probably read various texts of Jung and thought that, yes, this is probably the way that I need to think about.
But because I'm such a nerdy, excellent science guy, I'm going to tap into the good vibes rather than the bad frequencies. And of course, he's exactly wrong. When I was coming up as a young person, the joke about Freud is everything was the penis or the vagina, and the joke about Jung is everything was an archetype that we're inheriting from our cultural heritage. And both of those jokes, they're in some ways sort of true. What's curious about this movie is, step back a moment. When this is getting assembled and Christopher Hampton is shopping around his play turned screenplay and Cronenberg gets attached, and I guess they're casting about for performers for this thing, they're like, let's get Aragorn and one of those mostly naked guys from 300 and that chick from Pirates of the Caribbean, and we got something. And when we put all of those...
It's a dream cast.
Because each of them works against how they got established. Yeah. They're doing something that's very, very different, and at the same time, they're also magnificently accoutred. Their costumes are great. Their skills are definitely brought to bear on this material, and they talk around. They talk. The talking cure, which is the dangerous method, thus the title of the movie, is in fact how the whole movie is built.
There's nothing that a teenager would stay up until 11 o'clock at night to watch.
Right.
It's a very adult film,
and largely it's clean. There's not much profane language.
No.
There is outstanding emotional behavior, mostly from Knightley, but to a degree, when the two men start to come apart, we look at them being pained by their failing relationship, but they don't lash out and go to fisticuffs. They use their words. To listen to these men, who are wonderful performers, wearing these clothes in these settings under the direction of this guy Cronenberg, discuss their problems with clean, good, thoughtful language, is a real test.
I was on the Swiss-Austrian border, somewhere in the mountains, at dusk. There was a long wait, because everybody's baggage was being searched. I noticed a decrepit customs official, wearing the old royal and imperial uniform. And I was watching him, walking up and down, with his melancholy and disgruntled expression, when someone said to me, he isn't really there. He's a ghost who still hasn't found out how to die properly.
Is that the whole dream?
All I can remember.
Did you say the Swiss-Austrian border?
Yes.
Must have something to do with us.
You think so?
Everybody's being searched. Perhaps that's an indication that the ideas which used to flow so freely between us are now subject to the most suspicious examination.
You mean the ideas flowing in your direction?
And I'm afraid the old relic shuffling about in this entirely useless fashion must almost certainly be me.
Wait a minute.
Whom you very mercifully wish could be put out of his misery. A humane death wish.
Perhaps the fact that he was unable to die simply indicated the immortality of his ideas.
Oh. Yes. So you agree it must have been me?
I didn't say that.
No. Never mind. It's a most entertaining example.
What about you? Do you have a dream to report?
I had a most elaborate dream last night. Particularly rich.
Well, let's hear it.
I'd love to tell you, but I don't think I should.
Why ever not?
I wouldn't want to risk my authority.
Here's what I want to say about the very, actually, rigorously close connections, which are not obvious at all, between Dangerous Method and Re-Animator, is that they're both about the things that lie outside of normal waking life. Freud is a great genius because he really took this idea of the unconscious. He didn't necessarily think this was a good thing, and actually he thought that what he called the return of the repressed was inevitable. He thought it should be controlled. And
this is not just roundly good news.
No,
you got to put up the fence posts.
Yes, civilized life and civilization.
It's enabled by the fact that we all repress.
We repress stuff, and we come up with various ways of corralling our worst impulses and our deepest desires. Jung, on the other hand, and this is why he's kind of one of the founders of the New Age, thinks that this is all good, that we have these dreams, that we have these mystical visions, that we take psychedelic drugs, and that we read the I Ching or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and suddenly have a different experience of the world and the universe that we live in. And so they both started out from the same place and ended in a very different location and violently at odds with each other. That wonderful scene where Freud, after hearing Jung disagree with him about Akhenaten, about the original monotheistic Egyptian pharaoh, faints.
Sometimes when you experience cultural objects, your mood is sympathetic with part of its pitch, and it hits you a little harder than you expect. I'm drawn to the very conclusion of the movie when you have this epitaph. It's text on screen that tells you what befalls the three primary characters after the arc of this story concludes, which must be around 1920 or so. We learn, for instance, that Freud would eventually he would become a refugee from Central Europe, and he would die in London of lung cancer. And I think it's 1939 because the Nazis pushed him out of the continent.
But Freud actually effectively committed suicide. He had cancer of the mouth and the jaw for many years. Every picture you see of Freud, he's got a cigar in his mouth. Sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. It's not necessarily a penis. He had very excruciating oral cancer the last several years of his life when he and his daughter Anna, who later took over his institute in London, moved to London just ahead of the Nazi takeover of Vienna, and he died by morphine injection that he ordered his doctor to give him.
That hit me, kind of. That hit me, right?
But what happens to Sabina
is worse. Right? She returns to Russia, becomes sort of this mentor for younger psychoanalysts and therapists.
In St. Petersburg, and then
has children. They become adults themselves, and then she's exterminated.
She's not only exterminated; she is shot along with her two daughters in Rostov-on-the-Don, along with 20,000 other Jewish and Russian opponents of the Nazis in 1941. So you think about that, and you think about Freud's constant warning to Sabina about this explicitly. He says, "You don't understand. You and I are Jewish, and because we're Jewish, we're always going to be regarded as outsiders.
Right.
And that's why it's so important for us to maintain our authority and to say that we're completely medical and we're not doing these weird, cultish, religious things that our friend Dr. Jung has now gotten into." And
well, then the punchline
the punchline is that Freud turns out to be right.
Exactly right. Yeah. Jung lives for decades, I think, into the 1960s, and becomes the world authority of the mind science.
Yes.
And that's how the movie stops. So when I let the credits play through, and when I'm moody, sometimes I'm angry with an entertainment, I stop, and there it is. This one, I let the music play. Howard Shore's score is very good. I enjoyed listening to it.
I think it was award-winning,
But I found myself just moved by the way these three lives, which I see dramatized by these three gifted performers, by this gifted filmmaker, I was placed in the position of trying to imagine what actually happened to them, and it's kind of dreadful for two of the three. And for the third, as the performer, Fassbender, does his job well, I didn't like him the most. I liked Freud and Sabina more. And yet, I'm sad that each of them had their trials to go through, because we also leave Fassbender, in the role of Jung in the movie, in a state of emotional breakdown. He's not capable of performing his work as a therapist, because he himself is undergoing some kind of a complete mental breakdown.
No, and that actually is...
It's true.
That is a very, very famous period in Jung's life where he appeared to almost go crazy. It was like, and there's an argument about what induced that and whether it was self-induced, as though he himself descended into a certain kind of madness because he felt, in order to help and cure my patients, I
need to know it too, right?
I need to understand people who are going through hell. I need to understand that. But during that period, he had a series of what he described as visions. He wrote a book that did not get published until about 10 years ago because it was suppressed by his heirs, called The Red Book, which was the series of, in some cases, really wonderful drawings and colored sort of little diagrams that he made. He claimed to have had a vision before World War I began of the entire continent drenched in blood.
Mm-hmm.
And if you agree, as a lot of historians describe the teens to the late 40s as essentially one ongoing war. It was an enormous worldwide continental war, which I think is accurate. Then that's right. I mean, the entire world went crazy for about 30 years, and Jung claimed to have had a vision of all of this. That experience led to him going through this period where he basically couldn't cope. He couldn't treat patients. As that scene at the end where Sabina comes and his wife says, "Can you go talk to him because he's not talking to me?"
Yeah.
That was actually very accurate. He went through this period where he was almost cataleptic, and then he emerged from it, and
he's the master.
Again, reassumed his title as one of the great psychologists of the 20th century. Having said that, it's hard to imagine anyone watching the movie and not wanting to spank your